This is Stephanie.
And this is Brian.
Welcome to our podcast, The Making and the Remaking of a Codependent Mind.
This is episode 5 of season 2.
And we're calling it Loving a Codependent Mind.
A large focus of this podcast has been explaining how my codependent behaviors were especially activated when I was in some kind of relationship with other disordered people, most notably narcissistic people. Something we also mentioned briefly here and there too, though, was how those behaviors were also there to some extent even with people who weren't disordered.
For one thing, without all the self-awareness and the healing that you've gone through, you were vulnerable at any moment to those behaviors becoming activated in a lot of different situations. Even just day-to-day interactions with people from work or from elsewhere.
Yeah, I didn't even need to be in a full-on active relationship with a disordered person for these to be there. I just had to come in contact with one in some way. My emotional capacity was easily diverted towards giving my power over to pretty much any person or situation that I somehow felt threatened by, thereby feeling this need to default back to those codependent behaviors.
And these behaviors, like we talked about last episode, were so habitual that they didn't even necessarily need to be activated by a disordered person. You just had to feel like you were threatened in some way, even if you weren't.
Yeah.
Then you would quickly default to those behaviors because you thought you needed to protect yourself, or you felt it wasn't a conscious thought, but
right.
You'd have that feeling of needing to protect yourself.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I had all these unexplored trauma triggers and the sources of shame combined with this deep-rooted feeling of powerlessness that were kind of directing so many of my thoughts and behaviors. So even in a totally safe situation with an emotionally healthy person, those behaviors would still come up in different ways.
And while these behaviors were extremely dangerous for you, in that it kept getting you stuck with abusive people who took advantage of those behaviors, these behaviors also kept you from fully engaging in honest, intimate ways with basically everyone. Building strong relationships with emotionally mature people, strong, lasting relationships, was just kind of always a little bit out of reach as long as all of that remained unhealed.
Now that I've gone through this healing, I've been able to more fully connect to my sense of empathy for other people, alongside this more complete sense of self, clear emotions, sense of the big picture of my life. It's become more and more clear just how damaging and hurtful those behaviors can actually be for other people. So we're going to flip the script here for this episode and give a perspective of what it's like to be on the receiving end of these behaviors, specifically your experience with me.
Exactly. And so a couple of qualifications before we talk about that experience. One, I was very lucky with my childhood. I wasn't on the receiving end of the types of behaviors that would cause fear and trauma and shame. My feelings were validated. I felt empowered and connected.
Yeah, so all of these things that we talk about in the previous episodes, how that stuff got interrupted, like emotional development got interrupted for me. It didn't get interrupted for you. So you developed.
Exactly. I was well cared for. And I'm not just saying that because my parents are listening. A second qualification I want to make off the top, and this is also very important, is that I'm going to be saying some negative things about you and our relationship, but loving you has been one of the greatest joys of my life. And people who engage in codependent behaviors, who see themselves as codependent, should understand that there are people out there that will love them like I love you.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Thank you.
But let's go into
this stuff.
The challenging part of loving a codependent mind.
Yeah. What would you say would be the biggest source of the challenges that you faced with these behaviors?
I think it's a kind of cluster of behaviors that I would put under, and we've talked about this quite a bit, I've put under an overarching heading of Jekyll and Hyde behaviors.
Right.
So this kind of sense of, as we got deeper into the relationship and I started to fall in love, this difficulty in kind of reconciling these two parts of who you were, We now kind of think of them, and we refer to them for a while as the authentic Brian and the codependent Brian.
Yeah, right.
But during that period when they would both emerge, and they were in some ways kind of polar opposites of each other, it was very confusing and disorienting.
Yeah, right. Well, it makes sense that it would be, because it was for me too. And it really was like this kind of push-pull between two different sides. There were parts of me that wanted to let my authentic side out and do things, but then the other side of me said, nope, that's causing you too much fear. Here, do this instead.
So that would come about in situations, for instance, during that period, Jay still had access to you.
Right.
You were going through a protracted divorce, and also she was not eager to give up on the resources that you were continuing to provide.
Surprise, surprise. Yeah.
But we were also having conversations about that relationship, and you would complain quite a bit about that relationship, about her treatment of you during the marriage, and also her treatment of you. She was, continuing the threatening behavior. She would do what it sounds like she did all the way through. She would either be threatening you kind of legally or even physically or socially, and then she would turn around and kind of guilt you about, how hard it was for her to hold a job, etc.
Yeah.
So I would see that behavior directed at you, and then I would hear more what you were telling me, and we were starting to have conversations about the kind of the reality of that relationship, and I was starting to use words like that's emotional abusive and not a very good person, and you would admit
you were kind of easing me into the reality of this stuff, almost like on hindsight it seemed like you were being very careful, not because I know you didn't know what was going on with me, and I didn't either, but it was clear that if you kind of sometimes went a little bit too far with reality, I would back off, or I would do some kind of defensive posture or change the narrative or something.
Yes, that's true. And so one instance, we were having one of these conversations, and you said, Jay's a shitty person. I think you use those words.
Yeah.
And then later that day, or maybe exactly the next day, she calls you up. We're hanging out. She calls you up, and I'm in the room, and you spend like 20 minutes or 30 minutes consoling her, validating her. And, again, she's like, oh, it's so hard. I have a job and I have to support myself, etc. You're like, oh, you can do it, blah, blah, blah. And so it just kind of, it felt like, well, someone's being lied to.
Right, exactly, right. This doesn't line up at all with the conversation we just had like half an hour ago.
Right. Is he lying to me? Why? Is he lying to her? Right. Why? You're getting divorced. You're living separately. There was there seemed to be no reason, if you really thought she was an abusive, terrible person, that you would give her the time of day. So again, not understanding any of this. So there was that kind of confusion about what you were telling me and what could I take as trustworthy information about who you were and what your past was. So that was a struggle. There was also this sense of that example is one example, but there's others as well, of you are a very caring and kind person, but during that period, when the rubber hit the road, you would care for the person who was treating you the worst in any particular situation. Right.
That would take away my attention. So it did, whatever was happening with us or you, because you were going through some things also.
Yeah.
And my attention would just get diverted again and again towards caretaking this person, which was not actual real caretaking. There was real caretaking that could have been done during those days, being you. Instead, I'm doing this codependent caretaking of this person that was abusing me.
Right. Yeah. So I was going through a very difficult period myself.
Yeah.
And as you say, the priority was often managing Jay. And in fact, you would try to enlist me in managing her behaviors and her reactions and, trying to make sure that whatever could be done to make her comfortable and happy, you were still in that mode.
Yeah, and also enlisting you to to help me feel better that I initiated the divorce and breakup and everything too. Just like, like, I need you to tell me that I'm okay, that I was okay doing this, and that she was a bad person. Oh, but don't go too far with that, because then that's going to make me feel shame. And, it was quite the dance.
So, yeah. And asking from emotional labor from me to help you manage this person that, at this point we both agreed was kind of a crappy person.
Yeah.
Now that we've gone through this process and I can recognize codependent behaviors in other people in my life, I can recognize that dynamic in some of my friendships as well.
Yeah.
Particularly one very close friend who struggles with codependent behaviors, a similar situation. He has people in his life who treat him badly and have treated him badly and would treat other people in his life badly as well. But when it came down to those people or kind of healthy friendships, those people seem to always get more time and attention and resources. So I think that's probably fairly common with people
I would think so. Yeah.
that struggle with codependent behaviors, is that they're oriented, not again necessarily attracted to, but they're certainly oriented to the person that can cause the most damage.
Right.
And so
when it's not authentic caretaking too, like I said. So it's like, it looks like it, and I'm using whatever life skills I have that I've developed to caretake this person, but I don't need to, I don't want to, and it's not authentic.
Yeah, it's kind of trying to throw yourself on top of a bomb or something.
Yeah, right.
But unfortunately, it felt like to me, and I think it feels like to other people as well, that they're taking a back seat to this more important,
right, exactly,
quote unquote, relationship or more important person.
Well, and something I've learned throughout all of this, and is especially important to mention in this episode, is that I've, over the course of this whole healing process, I remember in the earlier days going, well, I didn't mean to do this, or I didn't mean to be dishonest or whatever. So that somehow diminishes the responsibility or something. But really, it's the effect. If I'm dishonest, I'm dishonest. It doesn't matter if I meant to be or not. Like, ultimately, it's still dishonesty.
And this isn't about kind of shame or blame.
Right.
This is about just describing what it feels like from looking in on the kind of codependent situation, not understanding what was happening there, and feeling kind of discounted or somewhat dismissed, or lied to,
right?
Because it's so kind of confusing.
And even knowing about the behaviors and learning about it, it still will be hurtful. I mean, it's still like, hey, okay,
So again, you would be telling me that I was the most important thing in your life, and then you get a phone call from someone who you, at this point, say you don't even like.
Yeah,
and your attention is immediately diverted to that person.
Right. I think possibly even at that time, this is a vague memory, but I might even said, I'm not even going to talk to this person anymore. Like, I'm not going to take her calls.
Right.
But I'll just deal with her in email or something. But here I was answering the phone and talking for a half hour. No, you'll be okay.
So there was that. The confusion and the frustration about having you say one thing and then do almost what appeared to be exactly the opposite, which made me kind of question, like, what's happening here? Am I being lied to? And then also this kind of caretaking of people that I didn't see as being worth your time and attention, certainly not worth my time and attention. And again, trying to enlist me in that, which was confusing. Yeah. And all of this caused also this sense of cognitive dissonance, which we talked about before, because I understood you to be, and I believed you to be as you are, which is a loving, strong, confident, interesting, sexy person, compassionate, could go on. And yet here you were behaving in ways that didn't line up with that.
Yeah. Right.
So we talked about the headdress incident in the second episode of this season, the one on emotional development, in terms of you addressing and learning to manage shame. And I said a few things about how it was affecting me, but to reiterate what I said then, because it goes very much with this theme of confusion over who you were and if I was being lied to, that was very much the feeling during that incident, because that you had engaged in this hurtful, bigoted behavior and interaction online, and I knew, and I didn't understand you to be that person, and you couldn't explain why it had happened in a way that allowed me to reconcile.
Yeah, especially the first conversation we had about it, and partially into the second one. Yeah, just like, there was a lot of I don't know or just who knows kind of responses to that.
Yeah, I don't know why I did that. I mean, initially it was, it was Jay's idea and she essentially made me do it. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense. You're growing up, you can't be made to do it. And that kind of exploded out as I learned more about the type of person Jay was.
Right.
That exploded out to, are you the type of person that's in a relationship with that type of person?
Right.
Like, why were you in that relationship?
Yeah. Why was that acceptable? Why was all of it acceptable?
So initially, and still, there's a lot of compassion for how she treated you, but she treated other people very badly as well.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand that. Like, how did you let her be rude to parents? You saw her be abusive to her daughter. How did you not speak up?
Right.
Because, again, I saw you as this strong, capable person, which you are, except when those codependent behaviors are activated.
Yeah.
So there was this cognitive dissonance that was hard to reconcile between how you behaved in your authentic self when you felt safe.
Yeah.
And how you behaved as your codependent self when you felt under threat, which was pretty much all the time during those two previous relationships.
Right. And part of, I think, what has made it difficult for you also is that the authentic behaviors look similar to the inauthentic behaviors.
Sure.
So that can hurt also.
This led to a lot of trust issues between the two of us. And in terms of who am I talking to here? Which Brian is going to show up in any particular situation? Can I depend on you showing up when I really need you to, especially if an outside force that might seem more compelling than me is also present?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it became a regular thing where I would just easily divert my attention towards something, a person that didn't deserve it. And it was like, well, okay, is this just going to keep happening? Like, and then it seems like the more we learned and the more we got into this process, there kept being new reasons for that trust to be diminished. So it's almost like it got worse before it got better, kind of.
It's true, because when I start to challenge you on these behaviors, then you would go into shame spiral.
Right.
And you would, as we say, kind of shame vent, which is say something maybe inappropriate or further confusing the situation.
Yeah. At really bad times and, just completely...
Just making things up. To try to explain things, and the things you made up actually would make it worse. And, But the turnaround for me, what's similar to the turnaround for you, is when we found this language that described the phenomena of codependency, especially then pairing it with narcissism.
Yeah. It was a very early discovery that kind of set the stage for a lot of this realization.
It was very, very helpful to me to have that framework to understand your behavior and to be able to at least start to appreciate this Jekyll and Hyde phenomena, what was causing it, what was at the root of it, and that the codependent behaviors were not, in fact, a reflection of your true self.
Right.
And the comparison is made, and we've used it to drug or alcohol addiction.
Yeah, sure.
I think that people who have friends or family or loved ones who engage in codependent behaviors can suffer in similar ways as people who are addicted to drug and alcohol.
Yeah, right.
Where we see the person making these choices to engage in behaviors that we know are destructive to them, that are destructive to their families and their friends, the relationships. Although even when we understand why they're doing that, it's because of this addiction or habituated behavior, it can still hurt. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, especially when the person practicing the codependent behaviors also has learned some things about it and now is kind of almost knowingly engaging these behaviors.
Yes, that would be extremely frustrating. But that wasn't really our experience, fortunately, is once we got this framework, you really put your mind to understanding what those behaviors were. That's when you started, as we talked about before, this writing process, when you went back to and trying to figure out what the origins of all these behaviors were. Yeah.
And it kept kind of being this like layers of the onion. Oh, actually, I have emotional dysregulation. So, and then open up that whole topic of oh, yes, that's part of the puzzle, is that I had trouble expressing emotions. Well, I think I still have that problem. So it was like things that I'm having to deal with while learning about these things. And then now another layer, another trust issue is like, am I really being honest about my feelings? Do I know what I'm feeling? And am I being honest about my wants and my desires? Do I have boundaries? All these things that are coming up, like good questions. Mm-hmm. And these are going to cause new sources of trust issues until we actually iron this out and figure out.
Yeah, so similar to addiction, there was a lot of concern in the early days. Are you just telling me what you think I want to hear? And you're going over here and feeding your codependent habits over here. Or, what if you're in a situation where all your codependent behaviors are activated? Are you just going to fall back into that way of behaving? Right. So it took a while for both of us to kind of trust in your quote unquote sobriety in terms of codependency. And it's not like you never get activated anymore, but you know what is happening when it happens to you. Yeah, exactly. I have a pretty good sense we're able to communicate it happening in real time. Mm-hmm. And so you do not fall back on your habitual codependent behaviors.
Yeah, it's just
very much anymore.
The stuff we were talking about in the previous episode, there are so many of these little kind of smaller scale habituated things, like the bad language and things like that sort of keep certain things going that, I'm always trying to monitor. Both of us are monitoring, that just always striving to be better,
And one thing that was tricky for me, especially in those early times when we were at least armed with this language of codependency and narcissism. Those were both powerful tools to help us understand what was happening to us and between us and what had happened to you previously and how to reconcile all of those pieces together. Mm-hmm. But it was still difficult for me to know how much I could push.
Yeah, right.
Because I didn't want to push you back into codependency, essentially. Yeah. I didn't want to... you needed to feel safe. And as we talked about in the first episode of season 1, you really struggled still to keep yourself safe.
Yeah, right. Actually safe, not this fake codependent safe.
Yeah, so the way you always kept yourself safe is to tend to or caretake whatever person's in the room. Yeah. Very often the person left standing in the room would be a person who wanted to be taken care of.
Yeah, exactly.
A narcissist or a disordered person. So you didn't really have the skills just to keep yourself safe in a relationship without doing that. So I certainly I didn't want to violate that sense of safety that you have, but I also wanted and needed you to take responsibility for your behavior.
Yeah.
It couldn't all be the codependency made me do it.
Right. Or this other person made me do it or whatever. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, it became clear what this habituated powerlessness started to become clear, because that was not something we really talked about much in the earlier days.
Mm-hmm. But I want a partner who's an equal and who is capable of intimacy. And in order to be intimacy, you need to feel secure in yourself and feel capable of keeping yourself safe so you can be vulnerable to another person. And you need to be capable of understanding your own behaviors, explaining them, and take responsibility for them.
Yeah.
So that was a difficult period to kind of negotiate me asking you to take responsibility for your behaviors without you collapsing into shame.
Yeah. I mean, that was a very common occurrence in the earlier days was just so many conversations got interrupted or ended with me just going into a shame spiral. And then we had to stop talking about something and then hopefully pick up the next day or in a couple days, just a lot of like unresolved conversations, especially in the really early days, like just kind of like, I can't talk about that, or we already talked about this. I thought we sorted this out already, just like kind of, no, I can't go through this conversation again.
So to kind of sum up, it can be challenging to love someone engaged in this behavior. As I said at the beginning, I feel very lucky that I never was in a situation that caused me to develop codependent habits
Yeah.
So I'll take that over. I'll take loving a codependent over being a codependent for sure, because, seeing how you struggled and the effect it's had on your life. And really your commitment to understanding what happened to you and to understanding yourself and working through that, even when it was tough, even when I felt hurt or sidelined or rejected, seeing that commitment from you has really made a huge difference in our relationship. And it made me very proud of the work that you've done.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm super duper glad that I did too, for both of our sake and for our relationship's sake. And it never felt as though you were trying to change me, like some kind of, like you were being codependent or something. It's just, I feel as though all along you saw that authentic side, and because it was there and you recognized it, and it was just like, okay, it kind of became this, what do we need to do to clear away the stuff that's getting in the way of the authentic side? And so that's exactly what you did and what we did.
Yeah, we put a stake through Hyde's heart.
Yeah, right.
Jekyll is the last man standing.
Right.
So we're going to transition at this point to season 3, which is going to be kind of a deeper dive into some of these topics that have come up throughout both seasons. We're going to shift the focus a little away from you and start talking about those phenomena and our ideas about those phenomena more broadly.
And so we're going to start this season with a discussion on this subject of boundaries.
Since it's such a prevalent term nowadays when talking about relationships broadly and then codependent relationships in particular.
Yeah, and I think it can be a difficult thing to really grasp, like so many of these terms, like what it really means, what's at the heart of it. Yeah.
So we hope you join us for that episode. You can find us on Instagram or Facebook by searching Codependent Mind.
And if you're enjoying this podcast, we would appreciate you leaving a comment or a rating or a review on whatever platform you listen to.